All right. Welcome to the lecture for this week, class. So we have a real challenge over the next several weeks. As you can see in the syllabus, we are going to be tackling the history of the Jewish people. In order to really understand Judaism, we really have to understand where the Jewish people comes from, and what their history represents to them. And then once we get through the history portion, then we'll be able to focus on some specific aspects of Jewish belief and Jewish practice, and we'll get a good sense of kind of why these practices and beliefs are essential, what their meaning are, when we can contextualize them in the history of the Jewish people. So that's why I felt like last week it was important to talk about just kind of an introduction to the concept of what it means to be a Jew. And for the next several weeks, we're going to be going over a brief overview of the Jewish history. Now, keep in mind, with any time you do a historical survey this broad, this in depth, it's hard to capture everything. And so we're going to have to move very quickly. In the process of this lecture, we're going to cover 1,500 years approximately, even a little bit more when you go back to the beginning. So if you have any questions, let me know. There's going to be a lot of great online resources if you want to just look up Jewish timeline or history of Judaism, history of Jewish people. You'll be able to do some research and study on your own, but I'm going to give you everything that I feel like you need to understand to be successful in this course, to have a very broad understanding of the history of the Jewish people. And this will really be instrumental and helpful in understanding Judaism, and which is what we're really trying to accomplish in this Introduction to Judaism course. So first of all, the lecture is entitled Jewish History Part 1, Biblical Beginnings to the Fall of the Kingdoms. Now, many of you are likely familiar with the biblical narrative, with the story of the Bible, and how the Old Testament connects to the New Testament, how the Hebrew Bible comes to fruition, and what some of the main stories are. But we're going to talk about some of that in the context of history. And some of you may not be familiar with approaching the Bible in this way, and we're not going to be doing a lot of biblical reading in this course. Maybe I'll add some at some point, but for now I'm just going to kind of lecture about these stories and this history that I want you to understand. But again, a lot of you that have read the Bible have likely read it from a devotional perspective, and so I want you to try, if you can, to separate yourself a little bit from that, to see the Bible as a history, because the Jews certainly see it as a history book. They see it as the story of their people from the beginning up until a certain point. So let's kind of launch into that. And again, there's going to be a lot to cover, so bear with me. Starting from the very beginning, we talked last week about the different creation myths that exist in Judaism. And by myth, I don't mean something that is mythical and not true, but myth in the sense of a designated explanation for something and how it came to pass. And so we learned about the Agon model and the Logos model, the divine battle, and the divine word models. So basically, the beginning of the Jewish people essentially sort of starts with Adam and Eve and the creation of this covenant with God and this covenant people. Now, covenant is important, and it's an important concept that we'll come to repeatedly throughout the semester, and that is, I talked a little bit about it last week, but it's a connection between man and God, man and women, mankind and God. Think of that famous painting on the Sistine Chapel on the roof. You have Adam reaching out and God reaching out, and their fingers touching and coming together. In a sense, that's what religion is. That's what covenant is coming together of the divine and the human. And that really starts with the creation of Adam and Eve and the beginning of this covenant people. Now, the Bible continues and progresses throughout time, and goes from Adam and Eve to their progeny, and follows the history as it develops and as the land becomes more and more peopled. And what we see is a significant importance placed on prophetic leadership, and we'll get more on this later on in this lecture. But prophets end up becoming very important and significant figures in the Hebrew Bible. These individuals that have been chosen, prophets and prophetesses that have been chosen by God and given a specific and purpose and a specific mandate. Now, one that's significant that a lot of people know about is this concept of Noah, the prophet Noah, who built the ark, who preserved the people during the flood, and through his progeny, basically, the rest of the world was populated, as the story is accounted in the Bible. Now, I'm not wanting to get into questions back and forth as to whether the story of Noah's Ark could be feasible or not, or whether it happened or not. That's not what I'm concerned about. Basically, what we do when we study religion is we take, unless you want to get into polemics, which is basically antagonistic writings in religion, attacking another faith or something like that, then what you do is you take the claims at face value, and you can understand a lot about the people and about the belief system if you take the claims at face value. And that's essentially what we're doing with the biblical narrative. We're not going to go into biblical, kind of the deeper biblical analysis that has been done over the years of various writers and things like that. We're just taking the account on its face and understanding it as the history and the development of the Jewish people. So one of the significant things about Noah is this concept that has arisen of the Noahide law or covenant. Many of you have probably not heard about this, but Judaism, as we'll learn throughout the semester, has always been a very insular organization, kind of an inward-looking and focusing organization, has not been extremely focused on outside missionary or proselytizing work. So Jews historically have not been looking to convert Gentiles to the Jewish faith. Now, there is a method of conversion, and there's a history of conversion in the biblical account. We see conversion taking place in the New Testament. But in this case, Jews have to have an explanation as to how God interacts with the rest of the world that aren't operating under the Jewish covenant. And that's where this concept of the Noahide law comes from. It's 7 laws that are extrapolated from the story of Noah and his family, and laws that are given to them after they disembark on the from the ark. And so the idea that Jews have is that the Noahide law is a list of 7 commandments that governs the ethical development of mankind and applies to the entire world, because the understanding is that the entire world comes from the loins and the descendants of Noah. So the entire world is under this Noahide covenant. And so Jews see those that abide by the Noahide covenant, regardless of what faith they belong to, as being able to be recipients of the goodness in the world to come as well. Whereas Jews themselves will operate under a distinct covenant. We'll talk about that in a moment. So that is important, because some criticisms of Judaism, some people think that Judaism is too insular and cares only about, its own adherents and not for the rest of the world. But there is this covenant that comes from the Talmud of the Noahide law that does apply to the rest of the world. So this is an interesting thing to understand about the Jewish people. Another significant concept that is important to the Jewish development of the Jewish faith is the patriarchs. Now, these are the early leaders that came even before the Jewish people were established. This is, the people that were Hebrew people that lived and populated the land. Abraham was one of the most significant leaders, and Abraham received a covenant from God, a promise from God that all the world would be blessed through his progeny, basically. So this concept of this covenant given to Abraham is a precursor of the Jewish covenant, and basically establishes a relationship and connection between Abraham and God. So Abraham is a very important key early figure in the development of Judaism. Now, significantly, Abraham also has a place in the history and lore of Christianity, as well as Islam. Abraham is a very important and fundamental figure in the development of Islam as well. So Abraham had a son who was named Isaac, who continued basically in the footsteps of his father in maintaining and perpetuating this covenant with God. And Isaac had a son named Jacob. And again, those of you that are familiar with this know how quickly I'm moving forward, and I wish I could talk in greater depth. We do have a lot to cover. So Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. And Jacob is very important and key because his name was later changed to Israel by God. And Israel became the father of the 12 tribes. He had 12 sons. Let's talk about that for a minute. One of his sons, one of his youngest sons, was named Joseph. And you may be familiar with the story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, who were jealous of the relationship that he had with his father, and also with the relationship that he had with God and the communications that he had received from God. And his brothers didn't like that much, and so his brothers actually sold him into slavery, where he ultimately arrived in Egypt. Now, this came at a time when Egypt was about to face severe dearth and a severe famine on the land. And so Jacob arose to a place of power through his ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh, who was the leader of Egypt, he became aware of Joseph's knowledge and his ability, and Joseph interpreted a dream that Pharaoh received that demonstrated that there would be this horrible famine that would come upon the land, and it would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of horrible famine. And so Pharaoh, understanding the connection that Joseph had with God, even though Joseph came from a different land, he appointed Joseph to be his second in command, and Joseph was in charge of creating the preparations for the period of famine for Egypt. And during that process, once the famine actually hit, there's this very interesting and intriguing narrative of Joseph's brothers coming from the land of Israel, coming from the Hebrew lands to Egypt, knowing that Egypt was the only place that had food stores. So they came to bargain and barter for food stores, but they didn't recognize Joseph at all because of the time that had passed and his involvement in the Egyptian society at that point. So there's this very interesting and heartwarming narrative that's worth reading and understanding, or at least watching the play or something like that. And ultimately, Joseph establishes a home for all of his brothers, all 12 brothers, and even his father Israel, Jacob, comes from the Hebrew lands and settles in Egypt. And the reason that I include on here forged in Egypt is because this Jewish identity, this identity of a people, largely begins in Egypt, because that's where the individual 12 brothers have their children, and they ultimately are identified as 12 separate tribes of Israel, named after each individual brother. And the people of Israel grows and grows, and after generations, the scriptures, the Hebrew Bible identifies that there came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So essentially, a new Pharaoh rises to power that does not see this growing population of Hebrews in their land as a good thing. And he actually enslaves these individuals. And so the Hebrew people that had come over here for respite and solace under the authority of Joseph are now slaves to the Egyptians and forced to build their their buildings and their monuments and things like that. And so that period of captivity in Egypt is a very important and forging period in the creation of that Jewish identity. And the escape from Egypt becomes something that Jews hearken back to throughout their literature very often, is the way that the Lord delivered them from Egypt and forged of them a mighty people. Part of the important part of that process was calling of Moses as a prophet. Moses is a name that probably almost everybody understands because he's known as the lawgiver. And the law, the 10 Commandments and the Jewish law that come from that, specifically the 10 Commandments, has become a hallmark of our ethical and legal system here in the United States and in many other nations. So Moses is a very significant and important figure, and probably the most significant prophet in the history of Judaism. Moses was called, and he had some connections to Pharaoh's court, but he was called by God and raised up and given power and authority to be able to deliver the Jews from bondage from Egypt. And there's this whole series of curses that Moses brought upon the Egyptian people because Pharaoh would refuse to allow the people to leave Egypt, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people. Moses kept going back to him with new ultimatums and offers, but Pharaoh would not listen. And ultimately, Moses had to, God had to issue a very significant ultimatum to the Egyptians, and that was essentially if they didn't let them go, there would be a catastrophe that ultimately occurred, and that was that the firstborn son of every Egyptian family was killed and died. Now, Moses went to the Jews and warned them that this would happen and challenged them and told them to paint the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a lamb. And ultimately, the destroying angel, which is the description of the force of the power that took the lives of the Egyptian children, would pass by them, pass by meaning the Jews, pass over their homes and spare their children. And that is the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Passover. We'll talk about that later throughout the semester, but that's the concept of the angel of death passing over the Jewish homes and protecting the people because of their connection to God and their willingness to be obedient to Him. So after this happened, Moses was able to escape with the people. One of the most significant miracles that's identified in the Hebrew Bible, most likely, is Moses arriving at the Red Sea. And actually, at that point, Pharaoh, having changed his mind, is chasing after the Hebrew people. And Moses, through the power of God, parts the sea, and his people pass through to the other side in safety. And then the sea closes down and collapses on the Egyptians at that point. And at that point, the Hebrew people are free. So that's a very significant point in the development of Judaism, and that's the escape, the Exodus. In fact, the second book of the Torah is identified as the Exodus. The Exodus, or escape, or coming away from or out of Egypt. Very important in the development of Jewish understanding and whatnot. The next piece is the creation of the law and Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was a mount that Moses ascended, and on this mount he received communications from God. He received the law directly from God, the law that would tell the Jewish people how to live, how to comport themselves. It was an ethical law, a religious law, a legal law. It identified how they would structure their society and how the laws would be governed. And Moses received this directly from God and then came down and presented it to the Jewish people. So we're not going to talk much about that reception or whatever. We'll get to that piece a little bit more when we talk specifically about Sinai and the concept of covenant and the concept of election by God and the various theories that are talked about among Jewish philosophers and thinkers later on in the semester. We will get to that. But this is important because Judaism is a covenant religion, and they believe that the instruction that they are given and the laws that they live under is based on a covenant that they have with God, a connection to God, a mutual promise to and back from God. So that's important because not all faiths are based on that concept of covenant, but Judaism is certainly a covenantal religion. All right, after receiving the law, the Jews travel in the wilderness for 40 years. And they have no specific home. And by the way, as far as timing, this is approximately 2000 BCE, before Common Era, or before Christ. So that's kind of the time frame. And the Jews wander for 40 years in the wilderness. They're fed by manna, which is basically bread that appears directly on the ground, and they gather it up directly from God. So there's this period of wandering in the wilderness that is a difficult time in the history and development of the Jewish people, but at the same time, it's a time in which their relationship and reliance on God is cemented, because even their sustenance comes from God. And they have to admit and understand that everything that they have, even the food that they eat and the water that they drink, which also erupts at the command of the prophet from stones, comes from God, and it's part of this covenantal relationship. Now, one of the things that we start seeing in the wilderness is the creation of the early concept of the temple, of the Jewish temple, this tabernacle of cloth. It's a portable temple. It's a temple that they can pack up and move with them as they travel in a nomadic existence throughout the wilderness. But it's the early creations of the temple and the concept of sacrifice, which is part of the Jewish law that Moses receives from Mount Sinai. So the tabernacle of cloth is a precursor to the temple. We'll talk about the temple in a moment. This idea of the passing of the torch of leadership is important, because Moses, who is a significant leader for the Jewish people, is not allowed to enter the promised land, the land that they are moving towards, that they are ultimately promised to inherit from God. Moses is not allowed to enter into that, and the leadership is passed to Joshua, who is another prophetic individual and leader and character in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, Joshua, when he crosses over the Jordan River into the land of Israel, he parts the Jordan River, and in a demonstration of the same power that Moses used, and in an understanding to the people that Joshua has become the new kind of prophetic successor to Moses. He's able to part the Jordan River so that the Jewish people can pass through into the land of promise. And the land of promise, the land of Israel, this just can't go without saying that this is one of the most important concepts to the understanding of Judaism, is this covenantal land. The land that was given to them by God, the land that they were commanded to basically flourish upon and to subjugate to their will, is this special land that is significant to their identity of themselves. And we'll see times in which they've been away from this land, that they have been removed from the land. But this tie to the land is essential to understanding the current state of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict. This is one of the most important and earliest concepts to understanding the current conflict, and that is the Jewish tie to the land that comes from God, from the law, from their prophetic leadership. That this is one of the promises that God would give to them, this inheritance in the land of Israel. And also, it becomes basically a warrior kingdom. The land of Israel is not empty when they arrive. There are other peoples that populate that land, and Israel is basically becomes a warrior-based kingdom where they fight battles to gain control of this land and to fight off invading armies and peoples. And so we see this a lot throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Israeli people coming together, the tribes unifying in the defense of their land, and being commanded of God to basically de-people the land, in a sense, to remove the unworthy subjects so that the Jews can inherit the land of Israel. And some of the significant stories that we hear about this that most people know. For example, the story of David and Goliath. This is a story of a battle between the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the Philistines, which is an area, a group of people that populated the current location of the Gaza Strip, which is right, to the southwest of the state of Israel. So this is a very important part of the development of the concept of Jewish power as well, that we see developed throughout Jewish history, is the fact that the Jews were commanded to go into this land and control it by force of might. Now, it's important to understand that the pattern of leadership in Judaism has not been the same since the beginning. It's changed significantly from the biblical time to the modern time, and even in the biblical time, there was a transition of leadership. At first, we had prophets. Moses was commanded to call leaders that could hold authority under him, so that he could be able to do what he had to do as the leader of the entire community, and still have individuals that had authority that could rule on smaller and lesser matters. And then eventually, as the prophetic leadership stopped, it was transitioned over to a series of judges that were appointed over tribes and were basically a different type of leadership, non-prophetic leadership, that is kind of a precursor to the creation of the concept of a Jewish king. Some of these judges that we know, there are some female judges, some male judges, and some of the most kind of significant stories in the book of Genesis and whatnot, and in the Hebrew Bible come from these judges. There's a story of Gideon, who protected the Jews and the Israelis against the Midianites, and through divine power and whatnot, and he was a judge. And there were a lot of other judges that had a significant role in the Jewish leadership and control. Ultimately, though, God chose and selected a king of Israel. The first king of Israel was a man by the name of Saul. But Saul, shortly after, lost his kingship and was basically stripped of it, in the sense that God would not allow Saul's line to continue the kingship, but God called another, and that is another very significant individual by the name of David. King David was the second king, but the beginning of a new kingly line. And all throughout the history of the Jewish people, it was commanded that the kings would come from the line of David, and this would be an unbroken line of kings. Now we'll see how practical that was and how that actually resulted. But King David is also like Moses, is one of the most significant figures in the development of the Jewish people. He was a warrior king as well. He conquered many lands. He expanded Israel, the kingdom of Israel, to its largest capacity that it was, and passed that on to his son Solomon. Now, Solomon is significant because he was the one that was commanded by God to create the temple, to actually build the temple, and the temple was built in the land of Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Again, very significant to the understanding of the current conflict in the land of Israel. This temple was built on the mount, and the temple was a place of sacrifice and a place of other offerings that took place, and we will talk in greater detail later on in the semester about the temple and the reason why it was so significant and important to the Jewish people. But it was a representation of their covenant with God, of their election, him having chosen them as his chosen people, and of their inheritance of the land itself that he had given them. And it was a way for them to offer up sacrifices under the law and to fulfill the law. So ask yourself real quick, if so much of the religion is based in this concept of the temple, of these temple rites, what happens to the Jewish faith if the temple no longer exists? And that is a question that the Jews have to ask themselves a number of times during their history. Before we get to that, I'll talk briefly about the kingdom of Israel and Judah. This is where the kingdom itself broke apart into two separate kingdoms. This was after the death of Solomon, and conflict that took place with Solomon's son and many of the people. And ultimately, the kingdom was, The kingdom was separated between the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. So it was basically 10 of the tribes of Israel were in the north, and Judah and Benjamin, one of the other tribes, or two of the tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were in the south, which included the land of Jerusalem. And they created two separate kingdoms. So as you read throughout the Hebrew Bible, many of the prophets that come that are commanded to speak to the people, some are Israelite prophets, some are prophets from the land of Judah. Some of the kings that are referenced are kings of the land of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and some are prophets, leaders of the kingdom of Judah. Now, one of the significant things is that the kingdom of Judah continued the Davidic line of kings, but the kingdom of Israel did not. Obviously, you can't have two separate kings that are both of the same line necessarily. So the kings from the land of Israel were not of the Davidic line, and that basically happened from the very beginning when there was a separation. All right. Now, this lecture, as you know from the syllabus, goes from the beginning of the biblical period up through the fall of the kingdoms. And I won't say a whole lot about this aside from the fact that the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, to Assyrian forces in 722 BCE. Now, the Assyrians had a method of conquering that was distinct in the sense that they basically took the people and they took many of them out and they repopulated the land with other people. So they brought in other people, and again, this is the northern kingdom of Israel. They brought in peoples from outside and populated the land. There were still some of the kingdom there, others that had been completely dispelled and dispersed. And those people, this is actually interesting for an understanding of the New Testament, those new peoples that were brought that mixed with the kingdom of Israel ultimately created a new racial identity that became known as the Samaritans. And so we know from reading the New Testament, the conflict that exists between the Jews and the Samaritans were basically a contingent of people that were partially some of the northern 10 tribes and some of these foreign peoples that had been brought in. So that's part of what demonstrates the antipathy that the Jews had towards the Samaritans, because it represented this influence from outside. Now, in 586 BCE, Judah fell and Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. They had a slightly different method. They basically just removed the people and carried them away into captivity in Babylon, and they didn't repopulate the land in the same way that the Assyrians did in the north. And that was significant because the Jews were later able to return to the land and repopulate the land of Israel in the south and Jerusalem. And there wasn't a significant amount of new people that had been transplanted to that area as there was in the north. So this fall of Judah and destruction by the forces of the original temple represents a very major and significant transition in the development of the Jewish people. And at this point, the southern kingdom, which is primarily Judah and Benjamin, but also had a lot of people from other tribes that were mixing in and mingling in the land of, specifically in the city of Jerusalem. That people in the south is basically what becomes the foundation of the Jewish people. So it wouldn't necessarily be the Israelite people from the very beginning, because there were some tribes that were broken off, but it's hard to sort of put the finger on exactly when the Jews identified themselves as Jews, but it's largely understood that it comes from this coalition, this coming together, this people in the southern kingdom that were later taken captive to the land of Babylon. So we will continue talking next week. And again, I apologize. It's hard to be real specific about all this because there's a lot to cover. But as a final 30-second overview, Adam and Eve and the creation leads to the calling of prophets and prophetic figures, the patriarchs, and the creation of this connection with God ultimately leads to Jacob, and his name is changed to Israel. His 12 sons end up transplanting to Egypt, where the Jewish people begins to develop in captivity, forged in captivity. Their identity is forged in captivity. And then Moses is called up as a prophet who helps the people become delivered through the power of God from Egypt. They travel in the wilderness, receive the law on Mount Sinai, establish a covenant with God, promise to follow him. They're protected by God, fed by God. They begin this concept of temple ritual worship and animal sacrifice, which is meant to fulfill the law that's been given to them. The leadership is transitioned. They receive the land of Israel as a gift from God, as a bestowal from God. Leadership passes from prophets to judges and ultimately to kings, with David as the primary king figure. His son Solomon inherits his kingdom, the large kingdom of Israel, with Jerusalem at its center, builds the temple, which becomes a significant gathering place and a representation of the Jewish identity. Ultimately, the kingdom separates into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom in the south. The northern kingdom falls in 722 and the southern kingdom falls in 586, with the southern kingdom being kind of the focal point of the formation of the people that are now and have been throughout time identified as Jews. All right, so that's a lot to gather, but for the lecture or for the quiz, I'll try not to go into too great a detail and try to hit some of the major points. But as always, I think a good recommendation is to print out these slides and take notes on them as you listen to the lecture, so that you can clue in on some of the things that I don't actually type into the slides themselves. All right, hopefully you were able to understand that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and have yourselves a great week.